So that was Neil Reiser's strengths and weaknesses. And the thing that was interesting, oftentimes conventional wisdom is something that dominates the political discussion. And those conventional wisdoms usually are not questioned until you have data to counteract it. So needless to say, when I got home Saturday night, the first thing I did was, once the precinct results were available, I was curious about what Neil Reiser got with the black community, or more specifically, how the black and the white vote went. And so what ended up happening, and this is from an analysis of precincts where the black voter registration is at least 70% across the state. Looking at the vote from that perspective, the black vote went 75% for Derek Edwards statewide and 76% for Edwards in New Orleans. And the other Republican candidates received single-digit support both within and without of New Orleans. There's another part of my analysis of the statewide results, which I think is also interesting. So one of the interesting dynamics you have had steadily occurring in Louisiana ever since early voting was, or more specifically, in-person early voting was introduced after Hurricane Katrina, was that more and more people in Louisiana are beginning to appreciate the convenience of early voting and are taking advantage of that provision in the law. So a record was set last November when 26% of Louisianians early voted for the presidential race. Last December, that was 21%. So in other words, you have a new normal that appears to have happened. And Saturday night, it was 23%. So in other words, a fourth of the vote was already spoken for a week before the election, which in a race where you didn't have much money to spend to begin with because of donor fatigue or lack of donor interest, my argument would be the time to convince voters was not the last week of the campaign, but the last week before early voting and the week of early voting. Philosophical issue, but one that I think is important for the Bayoubuzz listeners to appreciate. But what is interesting to me was when I looked at how the early vote went, and this, by the way, reinforces the dominance that I had referred to regarding the Schroder campaign. So 23% of Louisianians early voted, and amongst that group, Derek Edwards got 32%, John Schroder 24%, Neil Reiser 21%, and Angele Davis 19%. And so from that first group, which is those who early voted, albeit in person or through mail, John Schroder had a 4,700 vote lead over the Davis campaign. If you look at the remaining 77% who voted on election day, Derek Edwards got 31%. John Schroder got the same 24% on election day that he got with early voters. Angele Davis went from 19 to 23%. Neil Reiser fell from 21 to 17%. So just as the Davis campaign trailed amongst 4,700 voters with the early vote and ran fourth, she trailed John Schroder by 4,900 voters amongst election day. So for John Schroder to have had that similar performance, both looking at the early vote and the election day vote, that reinforces the notion to me that he was dominant. Since the numbers didn't really change, Neil Reiser, given that he had limited resources and those resources he used, he, in my opinion, did not allocate them most efficiently. There was a huge drop-off between what he got in the early vote and what he got on election day, most likely because he just didn't have the resources to have a final push. Angele Davis made a late push, which benefited her election day vote. However, if you run fourth amongst the early voters, that's half of John Schroder's victory margin. So that's what I saw happen in the election campaign for Treasurer, that is.
Sure. Well, that's a very good overview. So quite frankly, the only TV ad I saw the last, say, 3 weeks was John Schroder's.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Also, Edwards had a few spots.
Interesting.
Yeah, down here in the New Orleans area. So
yes.
I'm just wondering whether or not they were elsewhere.
They were. And that's a very interesting point, because this was something that definitely there would be a different story depending on what media market you were in. So I can tell you from my perspective of watching TV that John Schroder's ads started roughly about early voting. In other words, when you start seeing him in heavy rotation, and he hit just about every station. And he had two ads. There was, of course, the one of him standing up to the yes men, and there was the dance party ad. which he rotated. I saw that, I would say, about 95% of the content of the ads for Treasurer was the John Schroder campaign. Neil Reiser, I actually saw him run an ad or two on the Weather Channel back in August during one of those, believe it or not, which I thought, because the thing about that kind of thinking is it's very much out of the box, but if you figure that there's a hurricane that's close to Louisiana, people are going to be nervous and tuned into the Weather Channel. I could not think of a better time to run an ad. You could probably get some good ad rates at that time, too. You know, that kind of out-of-the-box thinking is the thing that I've always admired in campaigns, kind of like the time back in the 2015 Lieutenant Governor's race. There was a Saints game on Thursday night. Billy Nungesser was the only person who was running ads on a Thursday night game. But if you think about it, it's an act of genius, because in addition to all the people in the New Orleans metropolitan area who would be watching, you have Saints fans throughout the state as well, and they would be tuned into the game. And if you're the only person running ads, to me, that's a stroke of genius, as opposed to doing the cookie cutter idea of running ads during the 10 o'clock news or more likely the 6 o'clock news. So from my perspective, I can tell you, I saw a Neil Reiser ad. It was in August, I believe. There was one of those hurricanes back then on the Weather Channel. Angele Davis did not really start going heavy with her ads until very late. My understanding was she was doing buys elsewhere in the state because, of course, they're cheaper media markets. New Orleans is a very expensive media market to play in.
Sure.
And if you want to do it, you need to have a lot of money to drop into that region. And, you know, this is also what's kind of fascinating, Steve, when you're talking about the dominance of New Orleans in this election. Typically, the New Orleans media market, which is everything from Bogalusa to Houma and everything in between, in other words, the 504 and 985 area codes, typically represents 34 to 35% of the statewide vote. This time it was 45. So in this instance, and of course the vast majority of that 45, or a significant portion rather, was the approximately 20% that came from Orleans Parish alone. So if you were a serious statewide candidate, that 35, or in this case 45% of the vote, is too big for you to ignore. And I think that that's something that the Schroder campaign realized, because one of the things I was seeing, not only in my specific polling, but in looking at the election night results, was that John Schroder had consistently done better in a lot of my target parishes with the early vote. I started seeing the numbers reverse as the precinct vote was coming in nearly every parish with a few major exceptions: Jefferson, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Tammany. Those are some pretty big parishes. And so the point being was the Schroder campaign, because of their dominance, had the freedom to be able to do what it took to win, which meant dominating the New Orleans media market, as you're mentioning to me, as well as the numerous ads I saw elsewhere. So I think that was, wise use of media is certainly something that played a part in this, especially if you have the additional challenge of limited resources where you can't afford to be on TV for 2 months.